This video covers the printing of an intaglio plate. The plate should already be etched and ready to print. You don't need to degrease in advance unless the surface is unusually oily. Begin by tearing or cutting the paper to size. Mark the back of the paper with an X to make it easier to identify when you go to print. The back of the paper will have a mesh-like grid texture, and the front will be irregular. If you plan to use a registration grid, that should be ready to go as well. This one was made with mylar. The pencil marks are on the back side. The plate was traced to make the middle rectangle, and the larger one measured for the paper. Most intaglio prints are pulled using some type of cotton rag paper. This will need to soak before printing to give it the flexibility needed for the felts to push it down into the lower areas of the plate. You can gently bend the paper if it's too long for the soaking tray, but do not fold or crease it. Paper can be stacked in the water so long as water is flowing between the layers and air isn't trapped. Be sure that it is completely submerged. The length of the soak depends on the type of paper, but between 30 minutes to an hour usually. Cotton rag paper is typically fine in water for up to a day before it starts to break down. If you are using a communal studio, it's a good idea to put the paper in face down to prevent others' inky fingers from touching the print side. I will be printing with oil-based ink. Remove the ink from the can in a smooth manner, similar to frosting a cake, but in reverse. The surface of the ink should stay smooth and flat when you finish. Do not gouge the ink. Digging into the ink creates a larger surface area that is making contact with the air, so more of the ink will dry out and be wasted. This also creates more ink boogers. Turn on the hot plate and lay down a sheet of newsprint or phone book paper to protect the surface. Set the plate on top and let it begin to warm up. Lay out some ink on the ink slab. You need less for intaglio than relief because you won't be rolling any up with a brayer. Mix the ink around to warm it up and homogenize it. Pick out any dried ink boogers. Add in some burnt plate oil, a little at a time, until the ink reaches a workable consistency. It shouldn't be runny, but it shouldn't be so stiff you can't pull it down either. If you are mixing a color, it's helpful to do a drawdown. This can give you an idea of the color and tonal range your ink will print in. This works best if you use a scrap from the same paper you plan to print on. Begin with a small amount of ink on the knife. Hold the knife almost perpendicular to the paper and, using pressure, draw the ink across the paper. Gradually change the angle of the knife to closer to 45 degrees and reduce the pressure. The top half of the drawdown will show the lighter values the ink will print in, and the bottom half will show the darkest. Move the plate so two sides slightly overhang the corner of the hot plate. This enables you to apply ink all the way around the edge without getting any on the hot plate. The heat from the hot plate helps the ink move more easily. When the plate is warm to the touch, use a square of mat board to card the ink across the surface. Keep the mat board fairly vertical to better push the ink into the lower areas. Using C shapes allows you to apply the ink in different directions for better coverage. You can also use shopper's cards or plastic scrapers for this. If the ink isn't moving easily across the surface, the plate may still be too cold and need a little more time to warm up. When you've finished the first side, just flip the plate around to do the other. Even if you only have lines in one isolated area, you still need to ink the entire plate. If you don't, the negative space in the inked areas will have plate tone, but the areas you don't ink won't. Scrape off excess ink with the mat board. When the plate is completely covered, it's ready to be wiped with the Tarleton. From this point on, do your best not to touch the surface of the plate. Tarleton is cheesecloth that has been stiffened with starch. They're usually about 2 foot by 3 foot when unfolded, but are formed into a sort of bowl shape for wiping. Take the outside sections of the fabric and fold them in to create a smooth side, free of folds or edges. This is the side that will make contact with the plate. As you wipe, use a dusting motion that begins and ends off the plate, like an airplane landing and taking off. You don't want a dragging, sluggish pull that may overwipe some areas and underwipe others. If the tarleton becomes shiny or you notice areas thick with ink, rework it into a new pad so that it appears matte and absorbent. If the plate becomes too hot, the ink will loosen too much and you risk overwiping. If the plate cools too much, the ink will grow sluggish and resistant. Often this means taking the plate on and off the hot plate as you work. This is how the ink behaves if it's too cool. The dusting motion doesn't work. You may feel like you need to use pressure. If that happens, set the plate down and let it warm up before trying again. Tarleton is the first step. It moves the ink around and evens out how much of it is left on the surface. This is about how much ink has been removed when it's time to move on to the next step. Next is palm wiping. The palm of the hand is the absolute best for removing ink from the surface while still leaving it in the recessed areas of the plate. You can see the areas of the palm that make contact with the plate. Palm wiping maintains the luminosity of a plate without losing the darker values. Like with tarleton, this is also a light dusting motion. Your wrist will remain straight while you palm wipe. Do not smack your hand against the plate and pull. Typically, unless a plate is very large, I brace it against my hip or stomach as I wipe. If your hands are damp or sweaty, you can apply a little cornstarch to dry them. Periodically, your hand will become too coated in ink, and you will need to wipe it clean. I use the side of my apron, but a rag would work as well. Don't expect the ink to all come off in one layer. You're working your way there, and you may need to wipe the same area a few times. Pay special attention to the edges. This is where it is most common to see ink left behind. This last step I only use for line-etched plates. I do not paper wipe on aquatints, mezzotints, or any other type of plate that has delicate qualities or burrs of any sort. When paper wiping, do not wad the paper at all, but leave it flat and flush with the plate. Use phone book paper for this. It's easiest if you already have some ink on your palm or a glove to provide some grip. This is especially nice for large open areas and speeds up the wiping process. You can alternate between paper and palm as needed. Lastly, wipe the edges of the plate with a rag. This is just an old cotton t-shirt. Wipe in a downward motion and keep an eye out for any ink that might move to the surface of the plate. Palm wipe it away if that does happen. Check the back of the plate for ink blobs near the edge that may squirt out when printing. If the backing on your plate becomes damaged or melted, it's okay to remove it. It's only needed during etching. Set your plate on the warmer to keep the ink loose. Do not leave your plate sitting here for an extended period of time or you risk baking the ink. Just a few minutes to keep it warm. In the meantime, wash your hands. Set the pressure on the press and lay out the registration grid. Be sure the pencil side is down. Once the plate is warm to the touch, set it on the registration grid, taking care to line it up exactly. If you are not using paper cut to size and therefore do not need a registration grid, lay out a piece of newsprint to keep the press clean and set the plate on that. With the press set up and the plate in place, stop and wash your hands again. Dish soap and a green scrubby pad will remove the ink without stripping the natural oil barrier off your hands. Next, blot your paper using a clean towel. The towel should be well washed so it doesn't deposit lint onto the paper, which would interfere with the print. Lay the paper print side up on the towel. Fold the towel over and lightly rub the back. Shift the towel and repeat once. You want the paper pretty damp, but without any water sitting on the surface that would interfere with the ink's ability to bond with the paper. Water blotchy paper causes cloudy gray blotches on the print. Move quickly to the press so the plate stays warm and the paper stays damp, and line the paper up using the registration grid. Lay down a sheet of newsprint to protect the felts and run the plate through the press with good pressure. Never pause as you run the plate through the press. You may end up with a line in your print. A steady speed is best. If you are unsure whether or not you used adequate pressure, check the back side of the print. Proper pressure should yield a crisp embossment around the edge of the plate. Here is the finished print. This is a proof to help guide me as I continue developing the plate. If you used a registration grid, it will need to be wiped clean before reuse, to prevent any ink deposited there from transferring to your paper the next time you print. A rag is often enough, but you can use cleaner if it's being stubborn. This is why it's important to use the grid with the pencil side down. Every printer and every plate will have their own character, and you find out what that is through printing, so you may need to tweak or adjust this method to suit your needs.